Turn the jet around. The pilot thought he misheard it at first because no one gives that kind of order at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic. Not unless something has gone terribly wrong. Not unless there's an emergency that justifies burning tens of thousands of dollars in fuel every minute. But Jonathan Reeves didn't repeat himself louder or angrier. He just said it again, calm, precise, like a man who had already made the decision long before the words left his mouth. Turn it around. Now. There was a pause that stretched just a second too long, the kind of silence that makes people in expensive suits shift uncomfortably in leather seats, the kind that makes a flight crew glance at each other without speaking, because billionaires don't interrupt schedules, they control them. And this flight had been planned down to the minute, a non-stop route from New York to London for a meeting worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Yet here he was, canceling all of it without explanation, without hesitation. And then the hook that no one on that jet would forget, the moment that would later make headlines and leave millions wondering what could possibly be important enough to turn a private jet around midair, came from something so small it almost didn't make sense. A single message on a phone screen. Because sometimes the most expensive decisions in the world are triggered by the cheapest things. And in this case, it was a text that read, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't have money for baby formula tonight." Jonathan sat there, phone still in his hand, his expression unreadable, while outside the window, the endless blue stretched on like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had, because that message didn't come from a business partner or a politician or anyone with power. It came from a name that meant nothing to anyone else on board, Hannah Cole. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, she was sitting in a dim apartment, staring at her phone, already regretting sending that message. Already assuming it would be ignored like every other door that had closed on her before, because people like her didn't reach people like him, not really, not in a world where money built walls higher than anything hope could climb, and yet somehow, against every rule that governed his life, that message had made it through, cutting past schedules, past logic, past the carefully constructed system that had made Jonathan Reeves one of the most powerful men in the country. And now that system was bending in a way no one had ever seen, because the jet was already beginning its slow, deliberate turn, engines adjusting, route shifting, millions of dollars and years of discipline redirected by 12 simple words from a stranger, and no one on that plane understood it. Yet, not the pilot, not the assistants, not even the man sitting across from him who had flown halfway across the world just to secure a deal, because the real reason wasn't in the sky with them. It was buried somewhere Jonathan had spent his entire life trying not to revisit. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit or power or reputation. He was thinking about a sound he hadn't heard in decades. A baby crying in a quiet room, and the unbearable weight of not being able to do anything about it. The jet continued its gradual turn. So smooth, it almost felt unreal. Like the world outside had decided to quietly shift direction without asking permission from anyone inside. And yet inside the cabin the tension had thickened into something no one could ignore, because nothing about this made sense in Jonathan Reeves's world, a world built on precision, schedules, and decisions that always came with measurable returns. And this decision had none, at least none that anyone else could see, which was exactly why his assistant finally leaned forward, lowering her voice as if speaking too loudly might break whatever invisible line had just been crossed, asking him if something had gone wrong, if there was an emergency, if they needed to inform the London team. And Jonathan did not look up right away, his eyes still fixed on the screen in his hand, rereading the same message as if the meaning might change, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less disruptive. But they did not. They stayed simple, almost painfully simple. And that simplicity was what made them impossible to ignore, because there was no strategy hidden inside them, no manipulation, no leverage, just a quiet admission of need. And for a man who had spent years filtering out noise, ignoring requests, and refusing anything that did not align with his goals, this should have been just another message to dismiss, just another notification to clear, but instead it felt like something had slipped past every defense he had ever built. And across the ocean, miles away from leather seats and polished glass, Hannah Cole sat on the edge of a worn couch in a small apartment that smelled faintly of formula she no longer had, her phone resting face down beside her, as if not looking at it, might soften the silence. Because she already knew what it meant when minutes passed without a response. She had lived through enough unanswered calls, enough ignored messages, enough moments where asking for help felt like shouting into a void that never answered back. And her baby stirred softly in the next room, not crying loudly yet, just small restless sounds that carried through thin walls, the kind of sounds that made time feel heavier with every second. And Hannah pressed her hands together, trying to calculate what she could do next, who else she could ask, how long she could stretch what little she had left, even though she already knew the answer was not enough. It was never enough, and back on the jet the assistant tried again, this time more carefully, asking if they should prepare a statement or notify anyone about the change in plans. And that was when Jonathan finally looked up, not irritated, not defensive, just certain in a way that left no room for negotiation, telling her there would be no statement, no announcement, nothing to explain, because this was not a business decision, and the words themselves seemed to surprise even the people who heard them, because Jonathan Reeves did not make decisions that were not business decisions. That was the rule everyone knew, the rule that had built everything around them, and yet the evidence was right there in the slight tilt of the cabin, in the adjusted heading, in the quiet recalculations happening in the cockpit, proof that something had changed in a way that numbers could not explain. And as Jonathan set his phone down for a moment, he glanced out the window again, but he was not really seeing the clouds or the horizon. He was seeing something much older, something buried beneath years of success, something that had just been pulled back into the present by a message that should have meant nothing, and yet meant everything. Hannah had not planned to message anyone like that. Not someone she had never met. Not someone whose name existed in a completely different world from hers. But desperation had a way of bending decisions until they no longer looked like choices at all. And earlier that evening, she had been standing in the grocery store aisle under harsh fluorescent lights, holding a small can of baby formula and staring at the price tag as if it might somehow drop if she waited long enough. But it did not. It stayed exactly the same, just out of reach. And she had checked her bank balance again, even though she already knew what it would say, in numbers so low it did not even feel real anymore. And for a moment she had considered putting the can in her cart anyway, telling herself she would figure it out later, but later had already been figured out too many times before, and it always led back to the same place. So she had slowly put it back on the shelf, her hand lingering just a second longer than necessary before letting go, and walked out with nothing, trying not to notice how heavy that nothing felt in her arms. And now back in her apartment, she replayed that moment over and over again, wondering if she should have done something different, if there had been another option she had missed. But the truth was simple and hard to escape. There was no one left to ask, no family nearby, no friends who were not struggling themselves, no safety net waiting to catch her if she fell a little. Further, just a quiet room, a tired body, and a baby who depended on her for everything. And that was what made her pick up her phone again, even though every instinct told her not to, even though she knew how unlikely it was that someone like Jonathan Reeves would ever even see her message, because his name had only come to her by accident, a number passed along in a thread she barely understood, something about outreach or donations or contacts. It did not matter. It was not meant for her. And yet in that moment it felt like the only thread left to grab. So she typed slowly, stopping after each word, deleting, rewriting, trying to make it sound less desperate than it was. But there was no way to hide the truth completely, and eventually she sent it before she could overthink it again, her thumb hovering over the screen for a second after, as if she could pull it back. But it was already gone, and immediately the doubts set in, the kind that makes you wish you had stayed silent, because silence at least protects you from being ignored. And she turned the phone over, on the table, not wanting to watch it stay unanswered, not wanting to measure time in seconds and minutes that only made the waiting harder, while in the other room her baby shifted again, a soft, restless movement that reminded her exactly why she had sent that message in the first place. And as she stood there in the dim light, arms wrapped around herself, she told herself she would find another way if she had to, that she always did, even when it felt impossible. Even when the options kept getting smaller, because giving up was not something she could afford, not tonight, not with everything depending on what she did next. even if right now it felt like nothing was happening at all. Back on the jet, the quiet hum of the engines felt louder than before, as if every person on board had become more aware of the fact that they were no longer heading where they were supposed to be, and the shift was not just physical, but psychological, because when a man like Jonathan Reeves changes course, people notice, even if no one says it out loud. And his assistant sat back in her seat now, tablet in hand, trying to adjust schedules that no longer made sense, cancel meetings that had taken months to arrange, and send messages that offered no real explanation beyond a sudden change of plans, which only made the questions multiply on the other end. But inside the cabin, no one dared to push further, because there was something in Jonathan's demeanor that made it clear this was not open for discussion. Not this time. And he leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for just a moment. Not to rest, but to think, or maybe to stop thinking, because the more he replayed the message in his mind, the less it felt like a simple request, and the more it felt like something that had been waiting to find him, something that had slipped through years of carefully controlled distance. And when he opened his eyes again, he reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen before unlocking it once more, as if confirming that the message was still there, still real, still unanswered. And for a brief second, he considered replying with something efficient, something practical, something that would solve the problem from a distance the way he solved everything else, a transfer, a contact, an instruction passed through someone else. But the thought faded almost immediately, because that would not explain why the jet had turned. It would not explain why this felt different. And miles away, Hannah finally picked up her phone again, unable to ignore it any longer, her heart lifting slightly at the possibility of a response, even as she tried to keep her expectations low. And when she unlocked the screen, there was still nothing, just the same message she had sent sitting there unanswered. And she let out a quiet breath she did not realize she had been holding, nodding to herself as if confirming what she already knew, that this had been a long shot, that people like him did not respond to messages like hers. And she placed the phone back down more gently this time, almost carefully, as if it deserved respect for at least carrying her hope for a moment, before turning toward the small room where her baby lay, the soft sounds growing slightly louder now. Not urgent, not yet, but enough to remind her that time was moving whether she was ready or not. And she walked over, gently picking the baby up, holding them close, whispering softly, even though the words were more for herself than anything else, promising that she would figure it out, that she always did, even if she had no idea how. While high above, the jet continued its altered path, cutting through the sky in a direction that no longer matched any schedule or expectation, and Jonathan finally made a decision that felt even more unusual than turning the plane itself. Because instead of delegating, instead of creating distance, he opened the message thread and began to type, slowly at first, then with more certainty, choosing each word with a care that no contract or negotiation had ever required from him. Because this was not about precision or leverage, it was about something far less familiar. And, as his message sent, crossing the invisible distance between two completely different worlds, neither of them fully understood, yet that everything had already begun to change. The message arrived on Hannah's phone so quietly she almost missed it, just a small vibration against the table, easy to ignore if she had not been watching for it. And for a second she froze, staring at the screen without touching it, as if opening it too quickly might somehow make it disappear. And when she finally did, her breath caught in a way she could not control, because the name at the top was real, not imagined, not a mistake. Jonathan Reeves, and the message beneath, it was simple, almost as simple as hers had been. Where are you right now? And that was the first moment everything shifted for her, because this was no longer silence. This was an answer, and yet it did not feel like relief. Not yet. It felt like pressure, because now she had to respond. Now this was real, and her fingers hesitated over the keyboard again, the same doubt creeping back in, wondering if she was about to make things worse. Wondering if this was some kind of misunderstanding that would correct itself the moment she replied. But time did not wait for certainty, and neither did the soft, restless sounds coming from the next room. So she typed her address, reading it twice before sending, as if checking that it still represented a place someone like him would never come. And when she hit send, she immediately felt exposed, like she had just opened a door she could not close while thousands of feet above. Jonathan watched the message appear, his eyes scanning the address once, then again, committing it to memory with the same precision he used in negotiations. And he stood up without saying anything, the movement alone enough to shift the attention of everyone in the cabin, because Jonathan Reeves did not stand mid-flight without reason. And as he walked toward the cockpit, his assistant followed instinctively, trying to keep up with a pace that felt more urgent than anything they had seen from him before, asking quietly if they were preparing to land somewhere specific. And that was when the first real escalation hit, because Jonathan named a small regional airport that was not on any of their routes, not designed for jets like this, not equipped for high-profile arrivals, and the pilot hesitated, explaining that the runway length would be tight, that the logistics would be complicated, that it would require immediate coordination. And for a fraction of a second, the old system pushed back, the world of rules and limitations reasserting itself. But Jonathan did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Make it work," with a calm certainty that left no space for refusal, and the cockpit shifted into action, voices overlapping, calculations adjusting, a new path locking into place. While back in her apartment, Hannah stared at her phone again, waiting for a reply that did not come. Seconds stretching into minutes that felt heavier with each passing moment. And then the second escalation began to build, quieter but more personal, because doubt returned stronger than before, whispering that maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he would not come. Maybe he had already changed his mind. And she looked around her apartment, as if seeing it through someone else's eyes for the first time, noticing every imperfection, every sign of struggle, the worn furniture, the dim lighting, the silence that felt too loud. And she suddenly felt the urge to undo everything, to send another message saying it was fine, that she had figured it out, that he did not need to come. But her hands would not move this time, because something deeper than fear held her still, something that said if there was even the smallest chance this was real, she could not turn away from it now. And high above, as the jet adjusted its descent path, Jonathan returned to his seat, his phone resting in his hand again. Not as a tool this time, but as a connection, and for the first time in years, the distance between where he was and where he needed to be no longer felt measured in miles, but in something far more urgent, something that could not wait. The descent began almost imperceptibly at first, a gentle shift in altitude that only those paying close attention would notice. But inside the cockpit, every second now carried weight, calculations tightening as the pilot guided the jet toward a runway that had never been part of the plan. And in the cabin, the usual calm of controlled luxury had been replaced by something quieter, more uncertain, because even without understanding the full story, everyone could feel that this was no ordinary detour. And Jonathan sat still, his posture composed, but his focus entirely elsewhere, his mind no longer split between multiple deals or future projections, but fixed on a single destination that had nothing to do with business. And for the first time in years, he allowed a memory to surface without pushing it away. A small kitchen, dim light. A younger version of himself sitting at a table that felt too big for the space. Watching his mother move with quiet urgency, trying to make something out of almost nothing. And there had been a moment, just a moment, where she had paused, her hands resting on the counter as if gathering strength, before turning back with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And even then, as a child, he had understood something was missing, something important, something she could not fix no matter how hard she tried. And that feeling, that quiet awareness of not having enough, had stayed with him longer than anything else, shaping choices he would not fully understand until much later. And now, as the jet moved closer to the ground, that same feeling had returned in a way he could not ignore. Not because he was living it again, but because somewhere else, someone else was. And across the distance, Hannah stood by the window of her apartment, her baby finally asleep in her arms, the small rise and fall of gentle breathing, the only thing steady in a night that had otherwise refused to settle. And she had not received another message, not a confirmation, not a timeline, nothing to tell her what would happen next. and that uncertainty stretched thin across every passing minute, making her question everything again. Whether she had misunderstood, whether he had decided against coming, whether this had all been a brief interruption in his world that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. And she shifted her weight slightly, careful not to wake the baby, her eyes drifting to the street below where nothing seemed different. Cars passing, lights flickering, the ordinary rhythm of a world that had no idea how much she was holding onto a single possibility. And then, far above and rapidly closing the distance, the jet aligned with the runway, the landing lights cutting through the evening air, and as the wheels touched down with a controlled, steady force, there was no applause, no relief in the usual sense, just a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had just happened, because this landing was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning of something no one on board had planned for, and as the engine slowed and the aircraft came to a gradual stop, Jonathan did not wait for the usual procedures. He stood again, already moving toward the exit, his assistant calling after him with details he did not pause to hear, because for once, efficiency was not about saving time, it was about using it. And outside, the night air felt different, sharper, more immediate, and as he stepped down from a jet on an unfamiliar ground, there was no entourage forming, no cameras. Waiting, just a quiet urgency guiding his next steps. While miles away, Hannah adjusted her hold on her sleeping child, unaware that the distance she had assumed would remain permanent was now shrinking faster than she could imagine. And for the first time that night, something shifted in the air around her. Not visible, not audible, but real, as if the story she believed she was living had just been quietly rewritten without her knowing. The drive from the small airport to Hannah's address took less than 20 minutes, but to Jonathan it felt stretched in a way he had not experienced in years, not because of traffic or distance, but because every second now carried a different kind of weight, the kind that could not be optimized or accelerated, and the car moved through quiet streets lined with modest buildings and dim porch lights. A world so far removed from boardrooms and private terminals that it almost felt unfamiliar. Despite being part of the same country, and Jonathan sat in the back seat without checking his watch, without opening his email, without doing any of the things that usually filled empty moments, because this moment was not empty. It was full of something he had avoided for a long time, anticipation mixed with something quieter, something closer to responsibility. And when the car finally slowed and stopped in front of a small apartment building that matched the address exactly, there was no grand entrance, no sign that anything significant was about to happen, just a narrow walkway, a flickering light above the door, and windows that revealed nothing about the lives inside. And Jonathan stepped out before the driver could say anything, closing the door gently behind him as if instinctively trying not to disturb the stillness of the place. And for a brief second he stood there, looking at the building, as if confirming that this was real, that he had actually come this far for a message that most people would have ignored. And then he walked forward, each step steady but deliberate, until he reached the door and found the number he was looking for. And inside, Hannah had just settled back onto the couch, her baby still resting quietly against her, when a sound broke the silence. A soft knock that felt almost out of place at this hour, and she froze instantly, her first instinct. Not to move, not to respond, because unexpected knocks rarely brought anything good. And for a moment she considered staying still, letting whoever was leave, but something about the timing, something about the quiet certainty of that knock, made her heart start to race in a way she could not ignore, and she carefully stood up, adjusting her hold on the baby before walking toward the door, each step slower than the last as doubt and hope collided in equal measure. And when she reached it, her hand hovered over the handle, not quite ready to open it, because opening it meant finding out, meant turning possibility into reality, whatever that reality might be. And on the other side, Jonathan waited, not impatient, not uncertain, just present in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. And when the door finally opened, the moment that followed was quieter than anyone would have expected. No dramatic reaction, no immediate words, just two people standing on opposite sides of a threshold, both trying to understand how they had ended up here. Hannah's eyes widening slightly as recognition set in, not from personal familiarity, but from the weight of his presence, from the realization that this was not a misunderstanding, not a delayed response, but something real standing right in front of her. And Jonathan did not step forward right away. He did not overwhelm the moment. He simply met her gaze and spoke in a tone that carried none of the authority people associated with his name, asking gently, "Hannah," as if confirming that she was not just an idea on a screen, but a person standing in front of him, and in that small space between question and answer, everything that had seemed impossible just hours ago settled into something undeniable. Hannah nodded slowly, her voice catching slightly as she answered yes. And for a moment, neither of them moved, as if both were waiting for the other to explain what was happening. But Jonathan did not begin with explanations. He simply reached into the bag he had carried from the car and gently held out to her. And when she looked inside, her breath faltered again because it was filled with multiple containers of baby formula, more than she had expected, more than she would have allowed herself to hope for. And her first instinct was not relief, but disbelief, as if her mind needed an extra second to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. And she looked back up at him, searching for something that would make this feel logical, but there was nothing about it that fit into the pattern she understood. And that was when Jonathan spoke again, not to explain what he had done, but why. And his voice carried a quiet steadiness that made the moment feel grounded rather than overwhelming, telling her that he had received her message and that he could not ignore it. And the simplicity of that statement made it land harder than any long explanation could have, because it did not come with conditions or expectations, just a choice that had already been made. And Hannah felt something shift inside her, something that had been tight for a long time beginning to loosen, even if just slightly. And she stepped back instinctively, opening the door wider without needing to say anything. And Jonathan understood the invitation without hesitation, stepping inside the small apartment that contrasted so sharply with every environment he was used to, yet felt more real in that moment than any of them. And as he looked around briefly, taking in the worn furniture and the quiet signs of effort and survival, there was no judgment in his expression, only recognition, because he had seen versions of this before, not recently, but deeply enough that it had never fully left him. And Hannah carefully set the formula down on the table, her hands moving gently, as if the items themselves carried more meaning than their cost. And for a moment, she seemed unsure what to say, gratitude forming, but not quite finding the right words, until she finally asked the question that had been sitting between them since the door opened: why he had come all this way. For her, why someone like him would do something like this. And that question lingered in the air longer than expected, because Jonathan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the answer was not something he often shared. And when he finally spoke, his tone shifted slightly, not heavier, but more personal, as if the distance he usually kept between himself and others had quietly dissolved. And he told her that there had been a time when he was the one on the other side of a situation like this, not as a decision maker, but as a child watching someone he depended on try to solve a problem that could not be solved alone. And he did not go into every detail. He did not need to, because the weight of what he was saying was already clear. And as Hannah listened, holding her baby a little closer without realizing it, the story stopped being about a billionaire and a stranger and started becoming something else entirely, something that connected two moments in time that should never have touched, and yet somehow had. And in that quiet space, the real reason behind everything that had happened began to come into focus, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a truth that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Hannah did not speak right away after he finished, not because she did not understand, but because she did, and that understanding settled deeper than any explanation could have. And for a moment the room felt different, quieter in a way that was not empty but full, as if something important had just been acknowledged without needing to be repeated. And she looked down at her baby, gently adjusting the blanket, her movements softer now, steadier, as if the weight she had been carrying all night had finally shifted just enough for her to breathe again. And when she looked back up at Jonathan, there was still disbelief in her eyes, but it had changed. It was no longer questioning whether this was real. It was trying to process what it meant. And she thanked him, The words simple but sincere, carrying more than just gratitude for what he had brought, but for what he had done, for the fact that he had shown up at all. And Jonathan nodded slightly, not dismissing the thanks, but not absorbing it as something owed either, because in his mind this had never been about generosity. It had been about correcting something that once could not be corrected, even if only in a small way. And he glanced once more around the apartment, not with curiosity this time, but with intention, as if already thinking beyond the moment, beyond tonight. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was a quiet resolve behind it, telling her that this should not be something she has to worry about again. Not tomorrow, not next week, not any time soon. And Hannah blinked slightly, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone, because she had only asked for help once, only for tonight, and yet he was speaking as if the situation extended further, as if the solution would not end when he walked out the door, and before she could respond, he reached for his phone again, sending a message quickly, efficiently. But this time the action felt different, not distant, but connected to the space they were standing in, and within seconds he explained that someone would be contacting her in the morning, that arrangements would be made, not just for supplies, but for stability, for support that would give her room to breathe beyond a single night. And Hannah felt her chest tighten again, not with stress this time, but with the overwhelming realization that what had started as a desperate message had turned into something far larger than she had ever imagined. And she shook her head, slightly, almost in disbelief, asking quietly why he was doing all of this for her. And Jonathan paused, just for a second, before answering in a way that felt both simple and final, telling her that it was never just about her. It was about making sure that what happened once does not keep happening again. And the words settled into the room with a kind of quiet permanence. And as he moved toward the door, not rushing, not lingering, just continuing forward, there was no sense of an ending in the usual way, because something had clearly begun instead. And when he stepped outside, the night air felt different than when he had arrived, not because anything around him had changed, but because something inside him had shifted into place, something that had been unresolved for years, now carrying a sense of direction. And inside, Hannah stood still for a moment longer, holding her baby close, surrounded by a space that looked the same as before, but felt entirely different, because for the first time in a long time, the future no longer felt like something she had to face alone, and somewhere between a message sent in uncertainty and a door opened in disbelief, two lives had crossed in a way that neither of them would ever fully forget. Not because of the distance traveled or the money spent, but because of a single decision made in a moment when it would have been easier to do nothing, and instead, everything changed.